Everyone good? Amar?
You know it.
Amar and I affirm. Contention 1, smuggling. Millions of refugees have used illegal and life-threatening smugglers to escape their home country. Michael Birnbaum of the Washington Post in September explains that the journey of refugees is made by boat, foot, rail, and bus. And over the more than 1,000 miles between, smugglers are almost at least always involved in part of the journey. Anna Shea of Amnesty International in June explains the People Smuggling Promotion Program created by governments prioritizing their own national interests. Governments say that smugglers or traffickers are the problem, but in reality, smuggling and trafficking is the result. Inadequate government action is the chief cause. When people are desperate, nothing will stop them from leaving. Governments bear responsibility for preventing them from using safe channels, thereby forcing them to use the services of smugglers. However, Francois Crepeau of the UN in October explains, if states urgently adopt a new approach to migration that places the rights of refugees at the forefront, new legal channels for migration would create possibilities for refugees to securely reach safe destinations. Otherwise, the number of migrants risking their lives on dangerously overcrowded vessels over perilous routes can only increase. That's why Michael Diedring, Secretary General for the European Council on Refugees, declared in April, we could put smugglers out of business immediately if the EU would create legal channels for refugees to reach Europe. The impact is twofold. First, it decreases funding into terrorist organizations. Adrian Blundell-Wignall of the OECD explains in October, illicit money flows from human smuggling may be used to finance terrorist activity. Terrorist groups are increasingly turning to organized crime, including human trafficking and smuggling as a source of funding. Second, it ends the deprivation of life, liberty, and property from refugees. Orlando Crowcroft of the International Business Times reports in April, refugees who have survived the harrowing journey with smugglers tell horror stories, with widespread reports of refugees being sexually assaulted, ransomed, and often sold into slavery. The economics of smuggling is the callous driver that explains most behavior leading to the deaths of migrants. When the boats and trucks are overfilled, when food and water are not provided, when passengers are jettisoned into shoreline waters, money is behind the mistreatment. In fact, Adrian Blundell-Wignall calculates the destructive costs smugglers impose on refugees. On average, he finds, smugglers' fees amounted to 262% of a household's annual income. Furthermore, an analysis by the International Organization for Migration finds as many as 70% of the deaths it records refer to migrants who are missing, usually at sea, due to smuggling. Contention 2, international cooperation. International cooperation or multilateralism increases when governments prioritize humanitarian needs, tackling the crisis. The Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation explains in 2012, in the face of today's humanitarian needs, global solutions need to be provided by the international community. Bilateral actions alone cannot prevent or relieve the consequences of conflicts. As a direct consequence of the growth in global humanitarian challenges, recent years have seen an increased need for multilateral humanitarian action. Prioritizing the humanitarian needs of refugees begins the path to cooperation. Gil Lasher of Oxford Refugee Studies Center in 1993 explains, governments rarely act in isolation when developing refugee policies. Rather, they generally react to actions taken by other governments. The generosity of Western nations can be a powerful incentive in getting other countries to act humanely, but conversely, the withdrawal of this generosity can be devastating. The sole impact is solving the crisis. Lasher again explains, improving collaborative actions on the refugee issue provides for a more action-oriented system, developing quick and effective reaction to ethnic conflicts and refugee problems. Historically, Charlotte Alfred of the Huffington Post explains in September, in order to end the crisis of millions of Vietnamese refugees fleeing their home country, the key was international cooperation. Recognize that refugee protection is a shared global responsibility. Meraz Beg of the Huffington Post in September explains, in response to the crisis in Syria, if more countries opt in and assist with the refugee crisis, the burden is lessened on everyone as a whole. So far, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt have hosted the most number of refugees out of Syria, a total of 95%. Lack of cohesion means the crisis will continue to worsen. For any solution to work among European countries, they must work together. Ultimately, Kemal Kirsti of the Brookings Institution in October explains that cooperative deals in Europe between Germany and Turkey help address the biggest issue, solving the root cause of the Syrian refugee crisis. For those reasons, Amar and I are proud to affirm. Thank you.
Right, we want to see some evidence. Can we see from contention 1, gauging that says that we put smugglers out of business, and then can we see the 70% of deaths are due to smuggling?
Yeah. So this is Diedring. This is the deaths. If you want me to grab the full PDF.
Okay. So Diedring deaths. Wait. Can we see the full PDF?
Yeah, sure. For both of them, or?
Yeah, for both.
Sure. Actually, can you pull them up? Yeah. I think. Sorry. Okay. So they're both in the same article. but the article is quoting data. So here's 70% of deaths right here, and then so that's on the first page. Just like,
Okay.
And the seed ring right here.
Okay.
So DJ's last page, 70%.
Got it. Okay, we'll begin fresh.
Alrighty.
Okay, real quick, sorry, I lost one of them. Can you point out the 70%?
Yeah, sure. We have 22 so far. So
Oh, wait, I see it
Right
now.
here.
I see it now. All right, so we'll continue prep. Okay, that's it.
27 seconds.
It's a lot of exercise.
I'm a debater, not an athlete.
Right. Yeah. You chew out of breath with the 2 ends.
Everyone ready? Communicate. We have 2 observations. First, Dr. Yanzu Tong of Tsinghua University explains, because a nation contains both a government and a population, the idea of national interest in international politics includes both the interests of the ruler and the ruled. Second, according to the UNHCR, developing nations host 86% of the world's refugees. Thus, we should primarily consider the standpoint of developing nations in this debate. Our sole contention is that nations should prioritize infrastructural development over the needs of refugees. Infrastructure is the most relevant and universally shared national interest in the world. Richard Threlfall of ABC News writes that there is no bigger question for public policy worldwide than the need for infrastructure development. Martha Garcia Murillo of Syracuse University furthers that modern economies cannot function without efficient and adequate infrastructures. The prioritization of infrastructure investment has never been more important than it is now. According to the World Health Organization, globalization, population growth, and urbanization are placing considerable strains on infrastructure around the world. The developing world specifically faces the daunting task of creating new transportation, communication, water, and energy networks to reduce poverty. Poor countries and their lenders are currently jump-starting efforts to make these necessary improvements a reality. Author Alexis Crowe reports in recent months, key players in the industry have poured billions of dollars into global infrastructure funds. Problematically, prioritizing the needs of refugees trades off with effective infrastructure. The UN Refugee Agency explains that helping refugees necessitates diverting considerable resources and manpower from the pressing demands of development. In fact, according to the World Bank, reports on refugees and public spending in Malawi found that expenditures to help refugees empirically reduced the government's investment in infrastructure. The World Bank furthers that from 2012 to 2014, the fiscal cost of Syrian refugees on Lebanese infrastructure was almost $600 million. These costs are especially problematic because, as the World Bank furthers, with a plethora of competing demands, prioritizing infrastructure investment is crucial. This is true for 3 reasons. First, fostering economic growth. As the International Labor Organization explains, infrastructure creates jobs directly and indirectly by both requiring jobs to build infrastructure and increasing access to local goods and services, stimulating the economy and creating a multiplier effect. In fact, Cesar Calderon of the World Bank finds that a 1 standard deviation increase in all infrastructure sectors increases GDP growth by 5.7 percentage points. This increase is crucial because countries with higher GDP can afford to spend more on social welfare for the poor. Christina Weiser of Vienna University finds that increasing a country's GDP by 1% decreases its poverty rate by 0.86%. Second, improving roads. As the UNDP explains, one of the underlying causes of rural poverty is poor access to goods and services. They further that improving the quality and extent of road networks in rural areas alleviates this poverty by providing rural poor with the means to reach goods and services and alternative sources of income. This is confirmed empirically by Ifsal Ali of the Asia Development Bank, who finds in a study of Vietnam that access to paved roads increases the likelihood a rural household escapes poverty by 67%. Third, electrification. Brian Walsh of Time magazine observes that lack of electricity does more than almost anything to keep the poor poor, because it limits the ability to study, grow crops, and craft goods. Problematically, Rebecca Winthrop of the Brookings Institute explains that a lack of public infrastructure, including roads, transportation, and construction, has prohibited the extension of the power grid to remote rural areas. Infrastructure investment, by increasing access to electricity, alleviates poverty. Shahider Kankar of the World Bank finds in a study of India that household electrification decreases poverty by 13 percentage points. Ultimately, poverty reduction through increasing GDP and improving roads and electricity is the most important impact in the round. Julia Griggs of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation finds that children from poor families are 13 times more likely to die than those who are well off. I'll speed negative.
Yeah. Can we see the Malawi evidence?
Yeah, sure.
See the Griggs evidence you've got.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it okay if we get that if you pull that up during first cross?
I need my computer to prep my rebuttal. Can I get it to you right before?
Okay, sure. Can you pull it up on your partnership page?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Genius.
Oh, look, just
I don't know 100% if you have it down. Do you want me to I don't think it's up to you. Just move it along. Yes, this is Malawi and Greece as well.
Was there anything correct?
Yo, can we get some context for this Greek story?
Yeah, sure.
Just off that.
That's
And
the
then-
full paragraph that it's in, but I'll give you the full PDF. It's fine.
It's like a sentence.
Yeah, it's the full paragraph.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the full PDF would be awesome.
If you're gonna look at it before class, I can give you my.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. We'll continue. Cool, we're done. So we have like 21 seconds to wait for that. Okay, I'm good. Okay, ready for first cross? Are you ready for first cross? Yeah, everyone? Great. So this infrastructure you talked about, how long is that going to take to build?
I don't know. I mean, time frame. Like, what are you getting to the
I mean,
fact that you
so
should do?
here's the thing, right? Like, there's been like construction on the highway where I live for like 2 years now, on like this one branch of highway, right? So if the U.S., a developed country, takes 2 years to build like literally a branch of highway, how long is it going to take for a country like Jordan or like Lebanon
So
to like build
every
like
day
roads or
that
like
you don't-
electricity?
Every day that you don't start like building infrastructure is another day that you're not solving for rural poverty, but also
Yes.
for
You
refugees.
know what it also is? It's another day where more refugees die, more refugees are
And the
raped,
important
more
thing to
refugees are sold
note
into slavery.
is that in our
So
contention,
here's my question,
wait, real
right?
quick. The important thing to note is that in our contention, we don't say that you can't help refugees. We just say
Okay.
you can't prioritize them because when you
Because there's a trade-off,
prioritize,
right?
there's a trade-off.
Okay, great. So let's talk about that trade-off. This Malawi evidence, what is it like talking about? Like, where is it from? Like, where's it?
Okay, when there was a refugee crisis, it diverted infrastructure.
Where is
investments.
Malawi?
South Africa.
Right, South Africa. When's the date of that evidence?
I'm not sure.
The
But
1990s.
okay.
So
and-
how is it like applicable to like this trade-off you talk
Okay,
about?
what changes like when infrastructure funds are there and manpower is
I mean,
there.
like, your empirical
Like, what
evidence.
changed from 1997 to now?
Your empirical evidence talks
Like,
about
I
the
really
law.
want to know, like, what changed?
Like, I don't understand how it's applicable, right? Like, your empirical evidence is from the 1990s from
You are
allowing.
saying it's not applicable. Why is it not applicable?
So I would say first that the socioeconomic situation for the Middle East is totally different from Southern Africa. 1, in terms of ethnic compromise. 2, in terms of religion. And 3, also in terms of the way that
But
governments function.
the one is that there's funding and manpower for infrastructure.
Sure, but
and when you
governments
prioritize
in the Middle
refugees,
East
you take
function
away
different
that
than
infrastructure.
governments in the Middle East function differently than those in South Africa.
Okay, if you want to look to a modern example, the World Bank also tells you from 2012 to 2014, Syrian refugee crisis cost Lebanese infrastructure $600 million.
In 2015, what Amar's about to tell you in Rebuttal is that the Brookings Institute reported that Lebanon also saw a 2.5% increase in their GDP growth, which probably means that like
that
you get all the
negate,
capacity that
that doesn't negate the fact that there's a trade-off. Real quick, that doesn't negate the fact that there's a trade-off.
Sure, but like the benefits outweigh the harms, and
Can
like
we
the
go to
trade-off
your
doesn't really
contention?
matter.
All right, Rob is going to dispute that. Can we go to your first contention about
Sure.
smuggling? So the problem with like going to Europe is that it's really hard to get from point A to point B.
Going anywhere.
Right, exactly. So like you tell me that when Europe prioritizes refugees, they're going to see like more legal methods.
So
for
Francis
going
Coppola says any country does that.
Okay, but like specifically, can you tell me like what this legal method or legal ways
So like
people are going to
I can give you like a comparative example, right? So like the U.S.-Mexico border, for example, the reason why that like undocumented immigrants have
like
to smuggle
right
across
next
the border,
to each other.
right?
Like,
But like
Syria is not
here's the
close
thing.
to like
the Cropot evidence isn't specific to Europe, okay? It's talking as like a general idea, like if governments take this action,
But the
then
problem-
this will happen.
the
So
problem
for
is
the
that's-
governments that are in between the countries,
first off-
they don't have to smuggle in
Okay,
between.
the problem with this is that you only tell us that Europe is going to be prioritizing. Secondly, the problem
No, we
is
don't.
that you
We
when
say
that-
like Europe would lead to this sort of solvency. Like,
Right.
It's just like an example of how this would
So
happen.
you don't prove that the countries in between Europe and Syria are
Cropot
prioritizing.
says that if it did happen, then that's what
If
would
it
happen.
did, you need to show likelihood to have solvency.
Okay, I'm gonna do some.
Are all my judges ready? Opponents?
Yeah.
Ozan's always ready? Starting off on framework, a couple of key things here. So he tells you that national interests are in the interest of the rules and the ruler. And so I agree with that analysis, but make sure he proves to you what those national interests are and specifically why they should be prioritized over humanitarian needs. His second observation about how 80% of refugees are in developing countries. Sure, that's true, but the resolution asks us to look at the current crisis. We can logically infer that current crisis is referring to Syria, so in today's debate, you don't look to like 80% of developing countries, you look to the Syrian crisis and what's happening there. That's more important. Secondly, recognize in today's debate that my opponents are defending the deterioration of the status quo. Antonio Gutierrez, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, said today governments are prioritizing their national interests, and as a result, aid is being cut off, it's harder to enter countries, and more people are dying. That's really important because in today's debate, lives will be the most important thing, because once you lose a life, when human suffering is occurring right now, we should be solving for that right now instead of like prolonging it in the future. So if we can prove to you that the pro side saves more lives, then you should affirm, and insofar as the con is allowing lives to die right now, you should affirm just based on the chance pro maybe solves. With that being said, let's look to our opponent's arguments. So first, Ozan gives you two overview responses to their entire infrastructure contention that can take it out, right? They have to show me how long it takes to create this infrastructure, because we're telling you that millions of refugees are dying today. Like, if it takes years to build a road, if it takes years to erect, like, whatever they're talking about, then we're allowing millions of people to die for, like, the hypothetical chance that maybe it helps them. Moreover, all these infrastructure benefits refer to the people in countries, right? We should be looking to refugees in today's conflict because they're the ones who are undergoing human suffering. Now let's go on to the contention. So first they talk about how there's a need for infrastructure development and how there's a ton of money being poured into this. But their own author, Ali, talks about how most of this money is going to developed countries. So when all their solvency is coming off helping developing countries, majority of the funds aren't even going there. So majority of the benefit they're talking about isn't even happening. You can terminalize the impact right there. But secondly, he talks about a trade-off. Ozan alludes to this in Crossfire, right? Like in Malawi, there was a trade-off in the 1990s that isn't applicable today. When you look to the current crisis, countries have foreign aid budgets. Countries have infrastructure budgets. I'm not going to cut from my infrastructure budget to assist my foreign aid budget because they're already separate entities that are designated for one another. Then he talks about Lebanon. A couple of responses. First, according to the Brookings Institute, Massimo Calli tells you that when you look to these countries, in the long term, refugees benefit the economy. So when you want to look to welfare and stuff like that, after we're able to settle refugees, you see economic benefits that outweigh their infrastructure benefits. And moreover, if you affirm not only do you help the citizens of the countries, you also help the refugees because they're the ones who are getting these jobs, fostering the economic growth. Secondly, you can value this argument on time frame, as Kalina Cortez of Texas A&M University says that the benefits from the refugees occur in the long term, while he comes up here and talks about like costs from resource drains, those are only occurring in the years of settlement. The years when they stay there, you see benefits. Now, when they talk about their impact, first they talk about Calderon talking about a 1 standard deviation increase leads to all these like poverty benefits. First, recognize they have to show me that 1 standard deviation is met. Insofar as they haven't done that in today's round, I can't really weigh their impact. Secondly, they talk about roads. I live in Cleveland, and the construction sucks. I hate driving on it. Insofar as that's true, in developing countries like Jordan, it's going to be even harder to erect these roads. It's going to take more time. We just allow human suffering to continue. They're not solving for anything. Moreover, it's a non-unique benefit because in our first contention, we tell you if you prioritize stopping smuggling, you create these roads. It happens in both worlds. And finally, their last impact on electrification. It's only in India, has nothing to do with the Syrian crisis. And at the end of the day, I don't think turning the light on is going to be saving anyone's lives. And finally, their last impact is from Julia Griggs is literally ridiculous. It says it's a 13 times increase in death from unintentional injury or a 37 times increase in death from fires. It has nothing to do with poverty. In today's round, look to where we're showing you we're saving lives, and they're trying to claim benefits that aren't occurring 10 years later. For all these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
Can we see a lead that money's going to develop nations? A lead that money's going to develop nations for infrastructure?
Sure.
You ready to vote?
Develop.
Yeah.
I got
There's an RD.
Oh.
Sorry, just one more second. Here's the card. Whoa.
We can get you the full PDF if you want. But
Okay, no, we'll try this first. Okay, that's it. Actually, we'll run prep for a little longer. Everybody ready? All right. Start with an overview on their case. First, let's to Omar Dahi of the Forced Migration Review, who explains that infrastructure development initiatives, because they create jobs and increase access to services in nations with refugees, strengthen state capacity, and the most effective way to tackle the Syrian refugee crisis. At that point, voting negative not only gives you all the impacts of our case, but also includes every single part of their advocacy. Secondly, recognize they have to defend that the average nation should take in refugees because the resolution just says a government. The CIA World Factbook says that average nation is developing. They have to say that developing should take them in. They can't just solve through developed ones. But third, recognize that prioritize doesn't just mean time frame, right? If 10,000 people die down the road and 10 people die now, I still have to prioritize that long-term impact because we're saving more lives, which they tell you is important. Let's go to their contention one, where they talk about smuggling. First, they don't prove to what degree smuggling goes away. Like, smuggling is a profitable business. It's obviously not going to suddenly disappear. Make them link into this. Secondly, recognize that these refugees still have to get to the EU. The EU can't change legal channels in all the countries in between those nations. At that point, they don't have any solvency. Third, recognize they're going to come here and tell you that those nations should change it too, but to link into any offense, they have to prove to you that those nations are going to change it, or else it's just a plan. Secondly, you can go to their Beijing analysis, which is their big solvency card that says this would put smugglers out of business. Call the card. It literally never says that. It doesn't even mention these legal channels in the card. They're completely misconstruing that. Go to their first impact where they talk about terrorism. The card that they read you is just talking about general smuggling. To get any unique impact off of this, they have to be impacting terrorism specifically because of smuggling of refugees. They don't have any offense there. But now let's go to their big impact at the end of contention, which says like 70% of deaths are because of smuggling. We also call this, and it just says 70% of deaths are a result of losses at sea. It doesn't say the word smuggling. They don't link to any offense. They're misconstruing a lot of evidence here. Now let's go to their second contention where they talk about international cooperation. You're turning this against them in two ways. The first warrant is going to be interstate conflict. Refugee flows are likely to increase tensions between countries over the burden refugees put on one nation. Aidian Salahan of the University of North Texas finds that a flow of just 20,000 refugees from one state to another increases their likelihood of interstate conflict by 85%. In the long term, if we're taking in refugees now, countries aren't going to be able to cooperate. There's no international solution. They're not linking into any offense here. But secondly, you can look to Roger Zetter of Oxford University, who finds in a meta-analysis of 163 studies that the Syrian refugee crisis has had an overall negative, widespread, and severe economic impact on the main host countries. They give you a lot of responses in their rebuttal that how the economy is being benefited. We're showing you a better piece of analysis that the economy is getting worse. The implication for their contention, too, is that if the economy is getting worse in countries, they don't have any time to start working on these multilateral solutions when there's all these problems at home. You're turning the argument against them. Those impacts are specifically because of refugees. But third, recognize that in this contention, they're putting the burden on themselves to prove a multilateral solution. All of their evidence says the only way to solve is to do it multilaterally. And yet, in this entire contention, they don't give you a single iota of evidence saying that the way the solution is going to be multilateral. And they're going to tell you that their Brookings evidence does that, but recognize the Brookings evidence is talking about one bilateral agreement. A, that's not solving the crisis. B, it's only bilateral, so there's a linkage to their own offense. They're not getting any offense off their contention 2. Remember, they're not getting any solvency up 1. They're not getting any solvency up 2. They're clearly not linking into any impacts whatsoever. Let's go to the responses they put on our case. First, they give you this overview that infrastructure takes a long time to build. Fine, we still prove the solvency that it is going to be built because Crow says infrastructure funds are flowing into developing countries. We're still linking in there. Secondly, they read a response from Ali that says, like, lots of it is going to develop. I called the card. That's just not in there. Like call the card. It never says that. They're misconstruing a lot of evidence here. Secondly, they try and respond to the trade-off analysis by telling you that there's 2 different funds. First of all, empirically that's false because in the Malawi example, it wasn't 2 different funds. There was a trade-off. Secondly, that ignores the part of the warrant that's not just about money, but also about manpower and time. Remember, if a country's investing all of its time in helping, and manpower, in helping refugees, they can't invest it in infrastructure. There's still a trade-off. Then they review that there's no trade-off because of economic benefits. We co-opt that with the Zetter analysis telling you that the economy is getting a lot worse, so there still is a trade-off. Then down on roads, they say it's like really hard to build roads because in there, like somewhere like where he lives, it's really hard to build roads, right? We're telling you that specifically in developing nations, the Crow analysis says more money is flowing in. If they come up here and say like these roads aren't being built now, we're telling you that money is just starting to flow in by using refugees. You trade off of that. On our third impact, they say it's only to India, but that's not true. Electricity is a problem worldwide. You can look to the Walsh analysis for that. For these reasons, we urge you to negate.
Can you give the Zetter card, please?
Yeah, I'll pull it up for you.
Also, can I see like the general trade-off warrant you have in review and in your first contention?
Yeah.
Those 2 would be awesome.
Yep.
And we're not going to take that.
center.
Maybe on this one. Over center?
Yeah.
Just way over here.
Cool. So the original warrant is here, and then Zetter is this.
Great. And then can you guys just like do first and second while I look at this?
Oh yeah, that's fine. Great.
Any drink of water there?
Actually, yeah, I'm kind of parched. All right, cool.
Are all my judges ready? Okay. So you talk about how there's a lot of aid coming into developing countries right now, right? For infrastructure.
Like funding for infrastructure, yes.
Okay. So if I affirm today's resolution, why would that go away?
No, it's not telling you that the money coming in goes away. It's saying first, you're diverting resources and manpower to refugees, so you spend less time building up that infrastructure. Second, when the money comes in, that money can still be taken away by the refugee crisis. But
Okay, are you proving to me that it ever is taken away in the current refugee crisis?
Yeah,
not
we give you the Lebanon. We give you the Lebanon.
In Lebanon, we looked at that Lebanon card. It doesn't say anything about taking away from infrastructure. It just says that refugees have hurt the economy.
No, it said cost $600 million towards Lebanese infrastructure. All the judges can call it card, but I'm going to ask a question.
Okay.
So are you really disputing that being poor increases your likelihood of dying?
Well, I mean, like, I don't dispute that that's probably true,
Okay.
but like you're
Probably.
providing me, sure.
Okay.
But like when you want to quantify impacts in today's round,
Sure.
you have to tell me to what extent that's happening. Especially like when you provide me with poor, like misleading evidence talking about people dying from fires that has nothing to do with
I mean,
poverty.
we don't cite the fire part, but
I mean, the other part is talking about like unintentional injury, which also has nothing to do with poverty. Like at the end of the day, you're just like misrepresenting.
All right. Well, how about this? What do you think the factor is? What's the increase in likelihood of dying when you're poor? I'm gonna let you define for me.
Well, like, I barely can pass like AP Physics, so I don't think you should be asking me that question. But let's look to what's actually happening instead of like hypothetical benefits about how many people would die. The actual amount of people we're showing you are dying due to smuggling is 70%. You completely misread that card. If you want to call for it, judges, you can too. It says the word smuggling in the resolution, and we're showing you
It says the
today's
word smuggling in the resolution?
It says the word smuggling in the resolution.
Yeah.
And specifically, we tell you what Antonio Gutierrez says: millions of people are dying because governments are prioritizing the national interest. Can I ask another question?
You just asked one, right?
No, you just asked.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, where do you ever prove to me that you're meeting this one standard deviation increase?
On the GDP?
Yeah.
Well, okay, a couple problems. Like, first of all,
So you're
even
done.
if we're hold on, even if we're not proving an exact one standard deviation increase, the more important part is just the association, right? All we're proving is that infrastructure is going to help GDP in some fashion.
Okay, so basically what you're telling me is like, we don't have to prove that our benefits actually occur, but like just like logically, there's like a weak
I'm
link
just
chain
saying-
there that we might see the benefits in a very minimal amount.
I'm saying that the association proves that there is at least some and a pretty
Sure,
strong
that's what I'm
association.
saying. There's an association,
Okay.
but like you can't access your impact in terms of, and I can't weigh it in today's round if you're not proving you're meeting that burden.
First of all, there's a couple warrants why we would meet that burden anyway, right? We're telling you this money for infrastructure in the developing world is only just starting to like flow in. So if it's from like a zero amount of money being put into it into at least some amount, that's probably meeting a one standard deviation.
Okay, no, you can't just say like probably this is going to happen. Like you have to prove to me that it is going to happen.
I just say the association is enough to link into GDP in general.
Sure.
How
But
we
if I
gain
want to weigh your
profits.
impact in today's round, then you have to show me you meet those, or else like I can't really weigh them in like in terms of argumentation.
Why? I can give you warrants for why GDP is important.
Right,
which
but
I can
like
still
sure,
weigh.
you can give me warrants, but I can't weigh your argument.
Okay, we'll take a moment for that. Oh, too much exercise. Okay, so I'm going to talk about framework, staircase, voters. Everyone ready? Great. Start off on the framework that Amar tells you at the top of this rebuttal. He tells you lives are most important. They don't respond to this. But the important thing here is they talk about like this idea that like the infrastructure solves. Two important things here. You can rebuild infrastructure whenever you want. You can't bring back a human life. On irreversibility, lives always that way. You can rebuild infrastructure in the future. In time frame, what the most important thing is solving and saving lives now. Here's what Amar tells you. They don't respond to this. Antonio Guterres, the national leader of the UN on refugees, says, right now the status quo is deterioration because countries are prioritizing their national interests. In the affirmative world, we get a risk at solving all the lives of the negatives, making sure all the refugees that make sure that they die right now. Here's the important thing. Let's treat them like human beings. Let's not sacrifice some roads and some electricity just because we want people in the long term to be happy. Let's save some refugee lives right now. But moreover, on this point of infrastructure, they don't actually garner any of the harms that they talk about by affirming. First of all, they tell you that the main way that they link into infrastructure is by global funding. They never prove why that global funding goes away in the affirmative world. But second, on this idea of like this budget idea, what Amar tells you in the rebuttal, it's really important that countries have separate budgets. If the global funding is going into that budget, they're still getting the aid. There's no trade-off that exists. At that point, they can do this infrastructure point at any time in the future. They don't actually get the harms. But moreover, on the economy, they tell you that the economy is harmed, so infrastructure is going to be going down. But that evidence is from 2014. Amar tells you in 2015, the Brookings Institution explains that there's been a 2.5% increase in GDP across the nations that are hosting refugees. And right now, based off recency and time frame, Amar tells you that you should be affirming today's debate because we help the economy, we build more infrastructure. Then go to smuggling. They said that we have to prove that it goes to the EU to change, and they said that we have to show the likelihood. The likelihood is affirming. We're telling you that when you affirm, that's when this that's when this policy goes into place. They don't respond to Kerpove of the UN, who says that if a government puts their refugee rights at the forefront, then they create safe and legal paths to migration across wherever they want to go. That's important because it ends smuggling. According to Michael Diedring, it's in context. You can call for the card. That's important because according to the International Organization of Migration, which talks specifically about smuggling, we say we prevent 70% of the refugees that are dying right now from dying. That's the biggest impact alive in today's round. You can vote affirmative right there.
I'm going to take some. Yeah.
Start off the top of their case. They never respond to the Dahi analysis that tells you that infrastructure is the most effective way to solve for the Syrian refugee crisis. That means that if you want to solve for everything in their case, you just vote neg and prioritize infrastructure. So with that, go to their first contention about smuggling. Remember that their only solvency comes from Beijing, who literally never mentions legal channels. They don't tell you the likelihood that these legal channels get implemented. They don't tell you specifically how legal channels solve or how much legal channels actually solve the problem. It's impossible to weigh their impact. With that, go to their second contention about multilateralism. They never respond to the term from Salahan that tells you that a flow of just 20,000 refugees increases interstate conflict by 85%. At that point, they don't prove that the solution will be multilateral because conflict and tensions increase. With that, go to our first contention about infrastructure. They tell you that in this status, prioritizing infrastructure ignores refugees. That's not true. When you vote negative, that doesn't mean that you can't help refugees. It just means you can't prioritize them because when you prioritize, it trades off with infrastructure. In the status quo, the Crow analysis tells you that global funds for infrastructure are are growing. However, then we tell you there's a trade-off. They say the trade-off isn't relevant today. We can't isolate what has changed since 1997. Prioritize refugees diverts manpower and resources away from infrastructure. That's why in Malawi, the World Bank found that prioritizing refugees decreases the funds for infrastructure, and the same thing happened in Lebanon. It cost $600 million to Lebanese infrastructure when they prioritized refugees. With that, go to our third warrant about electrification, like improving infrastructure. They tell you that a light bulb doesn't get someone out of poverty. The Walsh-out analysis that they never respond to tells you that a lack of electricity does more than anything to keep the poor because it limits the ability to grow crops, cook, and craft goods. That's why the Concur analysis finds that household electrification decreases poverty by 13 percentage points. That goes unresponded to. We impact the lives because poverty obviously leads to malnourishment and death. We impact not only to the lives of the refugees that we're saving, but also to every single rural person in rural poverty. At that point, infrastructure affects the most amount of people in today's round. That's the biggest reason to vote for the negative side.
Let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay. So your entire reason as to why like infrastructure is like going to be happening right now is because global funds are going into it, right?
Yeah, people are pouring into it.
Great. So why do those go away when we affirm?
Okay, you're missing the point. The funds go in. It's not that the global funds go away. Right. The idea is that now countries can't utilize the funds. But can we ask?
Wait,
no.
That's
the problem. That's the problem. You keep saying we're going to devote manpower, we're going to distract from funds, but that isn't necessarily true.
Why?
Like if I'm a government,
our evidence says it's true.
Okay, when was that not?
Okay, your evidence in the 1990s say it's true.
Wait,
but
okay. I actually want to clarify this. This is really important. Why does the fact that that card is about the 1990s mean suddenly there isn't this like trade-off with manpower and with time the government spends on
First,
why is the time
so
changing?
first, 1990s is like pre-Soviet Union. Governments operated very differently.
Why?
Two,
How many different ways? What are the different
I mean,
ways?
like, look, the point. Okay, look, the broader point me and Mark trying to make here is that even if like you talk about this like manpower trade-off, right? The internal link as to why that's true is because there isn't enough funding, there isn't being dedication.
When has this not been the case?
No, okay, you're missing the idea that it's not the funding going in that's getting traded off.
I understand.
It's the ability of the governments to use the funding.
Wait,
but like to what point is that trade-off occurring? That's what I keep I don't understand, right? Like even if you prove to me a trade-off is occurring, what harm does that have on infrastructure?
We tell you that any trade-off to infrastructure is going to outweigh refugees because infrastructure affects
explain to me what ability means. Like, what's the ability to use the resources?
Okay, yeah, so we explain this in a couple ways. First, we say it's also about manpower in addition to resources, and we tell you that in Lebanon, like on the resource point, you're losing $600 million in infrastructure.
So we tell you, your evidence,
And
one, is from,
hold on.
One, your evidence is from 2014.
Yeah.
We tell you, like, our evidence, which is both long-term, it's more than a couple of years, and two, it's from 2015, you increased GDP by 2.5%.
Yeah, okay.
So on president, are we seeing a benefit?
That doesn't mean that the infrastructure trade-off doesn't happen anymore, because you're missing the second part of the warrant, which is A, about manpower allocation, and also the allocation of the time that governments give to each issue, refugees or infrastructure. You're only talking about the resource.
Okay, no.
Yes, question. Leave it on you for 2 minutes. Great. So let's talk about smuggling again.
Okay.
Okay, so on the legal channels point, where do you prove that if you vote affirmative, the specific policy that all these governments will do is providing
We're telling you, you guys ignore the co-evidence, okay, which specifically says that if governments put at the forefront, prioritize refugees, then what they'll do is they'll open up legal and safe refugees.
Specifically, the action that all of these governments in between Syria and the EU will take is opening up these legal channels.
We're saying affirming would do that because it would put it at the priority, right? We're not, the reason why it's not happening right now is because we're not prioritizing.
No, but my issue is not even if it's not happening now because it's not prioritizing, you have to show me that prioritizing leads to that specific type of policy or else it's a plan, right? You need to prove to me that the likelihood of that type of policy happening
So here's the thing, prioritizing over refugees inherently means partially that we open up our borders, right? That's the thing that creates the safe and legal
opening up borders. That's not what you said.
Safe and legal channels of migration is opening up your borders. That's the mechanism.
Okay, so you're saying that all the countries in between Syria and the EU will open up their borders.
When you vote F, that's what will happen.
Really, that's what they're going to do. Okay, if your evidence says that.
Okay, so you have 126. That comes across as one.
Couldn't pass it.
you guys ready? All my judges? Until it's ready, so I'll begin. Our opponents have already lost this round on framework in 2 ways. First, we tell you that lives are most important and they concede to this, but they also never respond to what Ozan tells you in summary, that the situation is urgent today. Insofar as that's true, the human suffering that happens today is irreversible. So even when they talk about saving more lives like 10 years from now, we can't allow people to die today in order to get this hypothetical impact that's not even impacting to. And the reason why they lose on this point is because they never respond to the evidence we continue building up from Antonio Gutierrez, who says if you negate today's resolution and you allow governments to prioritize their national interests, we've seen refugees dying in large numbers, we've seen decreases in aid, which clearly means negating today's resolution leads to more death. I see nothing else than a pro-ballot, but now on some voters. First, on infrastructure. So one, they never respond to what Ozan tells you, that these funds won't go away. And their only warrant here is talking about manpower, right? So first, the whole problem with this contention is they don't quantify anything for me. They're not showing the trade-off in manpower. In fact, what we tell you is that they already have set budgets. They already have set plans. They're not showing me they're changing these plans just because of an influx of refugees. Moreover, on this point, they talk about how poverty is related to lives. I agree with that, but if I need to weigh their impact in today's round, they need to tell me how much poverty, like the decrease in how much poverty saves how many lives. And finally, you can straight turn this argument because as Ozan cleanly extends to summary, the Brookings Institute evidence tells you that refugees help your economy, which means you have more money for infrastructure, you have more money for social services, you're saving more lives right there with their analysis. We win. They don't have time to respond to it. Secondly, on smuggling. Their only response here is the idea that it's not going to happen. We don't show a likelihood, but we specifically tell you, if you affirm, if you put refugees at the forefront, call for the card, then you crack down on smuggling, and they don't respond to Deidre, who Ozan cleanly extends to summary, says will end the smuggling industry as a whole. This is really important because when I refute their weak indite on our 70% card, that 70% of refugees are dying today due to smuggling. That's the biggest impact in today's round because it's irreversible. It's happening right now. If you affirm, you change that and you save their lives. If you negate, you do nothing and try to fix light bulbs. For all these reasons, I just want to urge and affirm this now.
Everybody ready?
No.
Okay.
Now.
All right. So turn to some observations. Remember, they never respond to the Dahi analysis that tells you the principal way to solve the Syrian refugee crisis is going to go through infrastructure. They never respond. You can clearly extend that. All of our advocacy includes what they're advocating for. But secondly, they never respond to the fact that prioritize isn't just about time frame, and if there are more deaths lost in the long term, then we should still link into that. Then go to their contention one. Call the dead ring analysis. If it actually says they end smuggling entirely, you can vote for them. It doesn't say that. 70% card. If it actually says that's all about smuggling, you can vote for them. It doesn't say that. If any of their evidence says that every single country in between the EU and Syria is going to entirely open their borders, which they admit in Grand Cross is the threshold for meeting their impact, then again, you can vote for them. Their evidence doesn't say that. Call for all of it. Then let's go to their contention 2. They drop the Salihan turn that because of increasing tensions, you're not going to see this multilateral cooperation. That's especially problematic when I put the burden on them in the rebuttal that their own evidence says the only way to solve is with multilateral cooperation. They're not linking in there. You can drop them on face right there. Let's go to infrastructure. They keep contesting the point of that money. And they say the Brookings Institute says because it's more money, we can solve for this. We tell you that ignores 2 other key warrants, which is first, manpower, which they don't respond to, and second, the time allocation of the government to either of these policies. Remember, when you look to Motley, when we use a real-world example, there was a trade-off with infrastructure. We are proving that trade-off. Next, let's go to electrification. They say this is just turning on a light bulb. Well, the Walsh analysis says it's a principal way that we keep poor people in poverty. It is really important. Next, you can go to the Concur analysis, which Sam cleanly extends, that says that infrastructure development by increasing electricity decreases poverty by 13 percentage points. Remember, poverty, when you're poor, you're a lot more likely to die, whether they contest the evidence or not, from things like malnutrition, things like disease. In reality, it's probably a lot more than 13 times more likely to die. We're still giving you Wang analysis there, but remember, even at the end of the day, if you think they're linking into this, and you think we were, the reason we outweigh is first, we tell you from Dahi we include all their impacts. Second, we tell you that from infrastructure, even if they prove they're a more empirical impact into deaths, we say infrastructure not only affects all refugees, but all people in rural poverty. We're outweighing on scope. We affect more people. We save more lives, even if you give them their impacts. For these reasons, we urge you to negate.
Nope.
You tell me to look, I'll look. Okay, cool. Deadry, the open borders, and 70%.
Yep, gotcha. Yeah, I got the full videos. That's fine.
Can I see the pro that it's going to Sure.
Okay, so you want to see?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first page is 70% is right there. That's what the 70% is, the marker page. And then on the last page is deeper. And up here is where it's deeper. And here, the open border thing is here.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Let me announce it. Okay. So, Okay. Congratulations to both debaters for getting this far. It's clearly an excellent round. On a 2-1 decision, advancing forward is the affirmative team from Hawken. I'll start my RFD. I sat. I am interested to hear my esteemed colleagues' reason for decision because I don't know how to vote aft in this debate. There are like 7 conceded framing arguments that make it impossible for me to evaluate affirmative. The multilateralism is key to the AF, and you concede multilateralism is turned argument. It like precludes evaluating offense, and it makes sense that if there's wars in the countries that they're likely going to do poorly at helping refugees. The negative and the Lives framework doesn't distinguish between those tax collects too, so I don't preclude any of their offense. The root cause argument that the only way to solve the crisis is to promote sustainable development and infrastructure, and the Dahi arguments resolve any residual link of offense because it means they capture the completeness of your story, and so there's only a try or die risk of a link at that point. I don't need to evaluate the degree of trade-off, but if I did, they extend please use the word labor rather than manpower in the future, just as an ethics thing. The labor and time frame arguments, like even if there are discrete budgets, and I have no reason to think that there are at all, but even if there were discrete budgets, the 3 tiers that they argue, 2 of which are just undiscussed. There's no ink on that. I don't know how to vote F, so I vote nay.
I think that, to a certain extent, you invited me, like, look at the card, it says, the ticket says this, vote for them.
Yeah.
If the card doesn't say that, like, opening these channels doesn't create free movement, I don't know what it says. And, like, I think if you told me what you think it says, as an alternative, like, give me your interpretation of the card, have me agree with you, instead of just, we don't think it says that, you interpret it. So you put that on me to do that. So, like, that became pretty big because if that happens, like, I at least have this, like, very quick, immediate time frame of saving these 70% of people that are trying to travel, how many ever that is.
Okay.
I think you're right, the 70% doesn't give you a lot of context, it just doesn't give a number in that card. But, 70% die, maybe, but I don't know the numbers. Like, it's hard to weigh that impact without it. If I'd gone a little bit further, I was at least a little bit kind of like the pro evidence in terms of like I don't know why the money stops or like what the channel is in the country to stop like the private investment coming in. Like, if the country is so overwhelmed it doesn't have laborers, that kind of makes sense. I don't think like the Malawi evidence, like I think it's still valid to a certain extent. You have an incredible country doing that. But to make it very clear that like the Malawi story continues because we know that this money's cut off. Like if you tell me Malawi's money comes from the industry when they say how will industry money come out, that makes sense. But in the end, I was invited to interpret a card, and like I don't see the alternative interpretation to it. So.
Okay. So there is a big play at infrastructure versus human lives. So the resolution clearly states based on current conditions, and so your infrastructure with a time argument. So I have to buy that the resolution gives that away. That I have to look at beyond current conditions, but it says based on the current conflict. So that I gotta weigh that, of course. That so now I'm not a big fan of this tit for tat on evidence. I'd rather you tell me that yours is better than his, and just that just gets in the way, in my opinion. So the other thing that weighs heavily on me is that they made an argument that the status quo is prioritizing national interest over refugees. Okay. Now the problem is that if you try to resolve that with development of infrastructure, it does not affect that today, the status quo. Okay. Now there was a couple other things. So there was presidents. Okay. They did not move their forward. Okay. So presidents, they listed Vietnam. Okay. the world did not end for the countries that took in refugees via Vietnam. The other thing that I weigh is that you just about called they're wanting to go to have unilateral cooperation to aid refugees a plan. Okay. The problem is that if you go to the other side, development could also be considered a plan because it requires that timeline. Okay, so and you're making a play at the following, which is on a macro level. You're trying to say that we ought to not band-aid the problem, but solve for the root issue. Okay, the problem is that so that you're trying to solve for poverty, and you're trying to make a play that poverty and money equate. And so I challenge you to delve deeply into the issue of poverty and understanding that there are intellectual, spiritual, and financial levels of poverty. Okay, so that is key. So when you look at that, then solving poverty is a heck of a lot bigger problem, okay, than solving refugee problems. Okay. Furthermore, if you're looking to solve the issue or the root problem of the refugee problem, you got to look at again at our point of view in which developed countries, like it or not, their interest in they're looking for their interest and their interventionalist policies in the places that this refugee problems are occurring weigh heavily on why that came to be. So if you're going to give me a root cause of the problem, please give me one that I can understand.
Congratulations again.